Today I'll speak about, the whole issue of coordination and how to get everything in sync. I think the whole theme of this conference is all about how do we, combine all the silos we have and disparate projects and have some kind of a way to bring it all together so that it all makes sense. So that's the theme of my talk. Now, one thing we know is that we can actually see the light at the end of the tunnel. For example, in energy transition, it's amazing the kind of progress we have made in solar power. There's been a decline of greater than 90%. And if you look at all the projections made, the actual progress has been faster than the projections. We look at the IEA figures for the last several years. So clearly, technology, innovation, competition, China, all this is coming together to really drive massive reduction in costs. So it's all within reach, and we expect that in the next few years there'll be a massive expansion of different kinds of renewable, but predominantly solar, both grid solar as well as PV, distributed PV. And also many countries now are actively promoting rooftop solar, distributed PV. So all that is taking off very well. And we also seen the dramatic expansion in electric cars and vehicles, two-wheelers, four-wheelers. China now, it's a significant part of the sales are new cars are electric. So we are actually seeing stuff happening. And therefore, more than the technology per se, it's how to bring all this together, how to coordinate, how to leverage all this to take it happen. Now, I'll give you some examples. Today, the biggest problem in renewable energy is something called permitting. It's not the technology, it's not building the solar plant, it's connecting the solar plant to the grid. In many countries, you can build the solar plant in a couple of years, but it takes 8-10 years to connect to the grid, which is really, because of the permissions and this and that. I was talking to a global CEO, and he was saying that if you want to connect a charging network, a charging station to the grid, in China, it takes 3 days. In India, it takes 3 weeks. Germany, it takes 12 months. And in the UK, it takes 18 months. So you can see that it's not a tech problem. It's a bureaucracy issue of permissions and streamlining the whole thing. So clearly, we have a lot of way to go to make this happen. Similarly, we know that with more and more extreme events, more and more farmers will be affected. And now we have enough technology to collect the data on extreme events, right? Every week I see I bump into somebody who says I'm launching satellites. So I think every second startup in Bangalore seems to be launching satellites. And they're doing all kinds of high resolution satellites, different parts of the spectrum. There's going to be lots of people launching drones. So data will not be the problem. There'll be a lot of data collection. But how do you make that accessible to the farmer at the point of taking a decision that can affect his life, his revenue, his livelihood, his product? So there's a whole issue of coordination. Similarly, we know that circular economy, reuse, recycle, all that is very important, but barely about 7% of our global economy is recycling, and we need to do much more in that, and I know you're talking about some of those things here, but again, that's a coordination problem. How do you make sure that the whole loop happens? Because when you have different actors, how do you bring them all together to make it happen? So what we're seeing is more and more, it's about applying coordination at scale for collective results. And that's something which is very important. Now, if you go by the normal way, we may have massive increase in capacity of production. But by the time you combine that with integrating that into the grid, and then, of course, connecting millions of people and businesses, this is going to be a 100-year project. Unfortunately, like no other thing in the world, the climate is a time-bound thing, because the more you delay it, the more likely that temperatures will go up. And therefore, if we can do something using exponential scale and pace, then we can actually make a dent in getting this stuff done. So this again shows that we have to do something very differently. Now, in India, we have dealt with this complexity and There are any number of examples of that, whether it's the fact that we now have 860 million new bank accounts with Aadhaar KYC, whether it's UPI doing 500 million transactions a day, whether it's Jio launching the world's lowest cost mobile network, whether it's ONDC providing, so many sellers, chances, and so on. There are many, many examples. So basically what this has shown or taught us is that you can actually solve population scale issues if you do it properly, if you coordinate it well, if you find the right balance, if you have the right architecture, if you enable public rails and private innovation, the whole set of playbook that we now have on getting this done in a way that we can create network effects and so on. So the question then becomes, if we know how to do this, and we have done this for the last 15 years, how do we apply this to the climate problem? Now, some of the specific things that we can think about, and I'll talk about a little more about that, is how do we get a language for energy? Now, why do you even need a language for energy? It's because your grid is fundamentally moving from a monolithic grid where you have huge producers, thermal energy, gas plants, maybe grid solar, and all supplying the same energy at the same price to everyone, to a world where every home is a producer, every home is a consumer, every home is a storer. Everybody is now going to be an active participant in the energy game. So the coordination cost is not just buying energy from 5 thermal power plants, it may be buying energy from 10 million households, right? 10 million rooftop solar is the goal that has been set in India. So how do you do that? And therefore, it's talking about how to get that done. It's about creating transparent, accessible carbon markets, which are verifiable, because otherwise all, my word versus yours. Now, these things are becoming even more important. For example, the Europeans are putting the CABM and so on, and they're now going to actually demand that you prove how much carbon is there in your production chain, and they will tax appropriately. So the whole thing has become much more complicated to figure out how to get carbon emission, carbon data done very well. And we talked about recycling. We just talked about the fact, and I think you are hearing also about the Deloitte project on stubble, that how do we get recycling going using open networks? And then we have, how do we get our cities to be much better? And then, of course, the whole issue of direct payments, and I'll come back to that in a second. So we think that to put this into action, we need to do, one is harnessing existing digital infrastructure, particularly in India. Because of our existing investment in this large-scale infrastructure, we can actually build solutions on top of that. And that is much easier to do than building it from scratch. So one is harnessing existing digital infrastructure. Second, of course, is building new things, because all the things that we want may not be tackled by existing digital infrastructure. Can we do something new? And then, of course, how do we use these open networks and take these things forward? So specifically, there are 5 things we're talking about, and there could be more. GSTN for carbon tracking, DBT for climate payments, unified energy for that, that millions of small homes generating power, a data grid for climate, and an example of circular, the Deloitte example, is how do you go from stubble to sustainable aviation fuel. So we talked about the energy thing. Now, as you know, that some of the people, in fact, they're all here, they've all come together, people in the energy business, and set up the Unified Energy Interface Alliance, and they're actually doing 1.5 gigawatts of transactions on that network. So anybody can go to any charging station, he can buy power from anyone he wants, he gets it at dynamic pricing, he then he pays for it, or you can use it for peer-to-peer transactions, because as we go forward, if everybody has rooftop solar, they can either sell it back to the grid, which is and the grids often don't like it because it means net metering and all that, and they lose revenue, or he can sell it to his neighbor. But to do all that, you need infrastructure for peer-to-peer transactions. And there are many, many cases of this kind of thing, all of which are fundamentally driven by the fact that we'll have millions of producers of energy, consumers, sellers, storers, buyers, whatever. And we'll go from a world of static electricity pricing to dynamic real-time pricing, because obviously with renewables, when there's excess production, prices fall. When there is less production, prices go up. So everybody is a trader of energy in this new world, and we need to gear up for that. For that, you need an architecture which allows everyone to plug in, and that's what the UAI is doing. Or the project which people like Tata Motors and TaxGenie are looking at is we already have the infrastructure for net invoicing in India, right? Because if you look at what's happening in GST, GST is a system where 12 million businesses file their returns electronically. And they not only file returns, they also file invoice level details, line item level details. So you actually already have an existing system where businesses, to get their tax credits, are filing invoice line item level details of what they're producing. And you can take that same infrastructure and put the carbon footprint of the products that you're producing, and then you can create an automatic netting mechanism of how much carbon each part of the supply chain is creating. And if tomorrow, if you're going to have a price for that, then you can use carbon offsets pricing, just like we do tax out, like the VAT is GST is a value-added tax. So, each part of the chain can offset the value add. So you can do the same thing for carbon. And this is something, an example of a +1, because we already have a very advanced GST system, which is able to transact with millions of line item details. We just put a carbon layer on top of it. Or how do you think about circularity and the issue of stubble, which is again, stubble is a big problem. Everybody in Delhi complains every time some farmer in Punjab burns some stubble, and they all start running away and all that, and Supreme Court gets involved. All those things happen. But is there something we can do with that stubble, which is what Deloitte has been working for many years, which is either you can make it into mulch in situ, or you can convert it into some kind of a briquette, or ultimate game would be to convert it into sustainable aviation fuel, and so on. There are many options. But the idea is actually implement circularity to benefit farmers because they get money out of it, to benefit the environment because there's less pollution in Delhi, and you're getting something out of that product which can create, cut down on the aviation fuel and make it more sustainable. So everybody wins. So there's, again, an example of how we can use circularity at scale to get different things done. This is, of course, will have to be a brand new system. It's not a +1. And then there's the whole issue of how do we use data for climate action? Because today, all data collection, by and large, is purpose-specific. So there's some data for purpose A, B, C. But how do you design it architecturally that the data comes and different use cases can be built on top of that? So whether it's city planning or whether it's disaster resilience, forest, you should create a data grid. And again, this could be done with an open network where all the different elements of data sources are all connected together and can be used very easily. And so this, again, is a new thing that you would need. And then, of course, how do we reuse DBT infrastructure? Why is this important? Because in India, we have the world's largest DBT infrastructure, right? We have 1.3 billion people with a digital ID. We have 760 million people with an Aadhaar-linked bank account. We have transferred cumulatively $300 billion of direct benefit transfer. Can we now repurpose this plumbing, very agile, real-time plumbing, for climate purposes? For example, you want to, today, for example, in DBT for LPG, we give a subsidy to the person who is buying an LPG cylinder. So he buys an LPG cylinder for, say, 600 rupees, he gets a 200 rupees subsidy. the subsidy comes into the bank account. But tomorrow you may argue that we should not be subsidizing hydrocarbons. Let's give that 200 rupees towards an induction heater or whatever. So the idea is once you have unbundled the subsidy from the product, then the subsidy is a financial thing which you can move to, say, a renewable product. Or you want to give payments to people in forests, not to cut down stuff like the RED protocol, and then again you can give them subsidies. So the beauty of it is we now have the world's largest plumbing to transfer money to anyone in real time. And we can use that for all kinds of climate purposes. You can give subsidy. For example, people are getting subsidized to implement rooftop solar. You can use this platform for sending the subsidies. So the whole issue of behavior change in the climate space is linked to providing financial incentive. That's one of the things. And luckily for us, we already have the infrastructure for doing financial incentives at an individual level at scale. And we can apply that for climate action. I'm just trying to give examples, very practical examples of how we are now at a point where we have the execution models for doing these things at scale. And then, as we look forward, we're looking at how do we do things like, we are also working on another big idea called Finternet, which is how do you create tokenization of assets. And we think that's a big part of changing the financial system. But we believe that actually the idea of Beckn, which is decentralized transactions, and the idea of Finternet, which is decentralized assets, can come together. And that basically what it does is it allows you to tokenize a loan or a deposit or real estate and so on. And I'll give you just one example. You say these guys are just piling on stuff. But I'll give you an example of how this could work. Let's say that you have an individual person buying rooftop solar. Now, there are two ways to financially subsidize that. One is to actually give him money as a subsidy. The second is to give him credit at a concessional price, right? So this person will buy the rooftop solar. He or she will buy a battery, or they will use the battery they have in their EV. They will then produce electricity for their own consumption. If there's excess electricity, they'll sell back to the grid with net metering, or they will sell to the neighbor with peer-to-peer transactions. They will buy from the grid during the daytime when the price of power is low. Today, as you know, in places like California, it's negative price during the day because there's more production than consumption. And they can sell back to the grid at night when there is extra power. They can set the charging of their EV to that time of the day when power is cheap. So all sort of stuff is going to be happening. So that's all using the Beckn UEI kind of model. But I also want to get that loan. I want to get access to some special scheme which gives me a sustainability financing at a lower interest rate. Then when I invest in my rooftop solar, I would go to a verification agency that will verify that I have indeed done this. They will give a credential, a certificate saying that you've done it. You tokenize that, and you put the token on the grid, and somebody gives a loan because they know that this is a proven investment in sustainability. So that's an example of how we visualize the Beckn decentralized protocol working with the asset tokenization that we have. And we'll actually see examples of this in the coming year or two. So I think the point is we're now at a place where it's about execution. It's about making it happen. We can continue to have discussions. We can continue to have COPs 30, 31, 32, argument. All that you can keep doing, and we encourage people to do that. But actually, on the ground, we now have the technology, the capability, the ability to make this work. In India, particularly because of our historic investment in digital infrastructure, we can accelerate these things. We can actually become a role model on how to get this done at speed and scale. And that's what I had to present. Thank you very much.